Joined here today for what is the 8th in our interview series for the Witan with one Evelyn. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for having me involved in the event.
Oh no, it's our pleasure. Now you were a guest at our event last year, so this time you're coming as a speaker. So, what did you think of attending last year? Was it just what were your thoughts?
Well, I think I sort of mentioned on Telegram the other day that really it was the highlight of my year last year.
Oh
Really,
wow.
it was. I mean, for me, it's the same feeling I get as we might discuss with some of the Nomos events I've done. It's great to have the speeches. The food's lovely. It's nice to see everyone sort of dressed up and putting on their best. But ultimately, the fact that we are all in the one place together,
Mm.
three figures worth of us all nattering away and conversing about all these different subjects. I mean, I suppose I maybe in a slightly different position than a lot of other people who are attend or go to because they don't get the opportunity to discuss the subjects we are interested in and day out. Whereas I suppose I kind of do, but I like the fact that that environment is then brought to other people.
Hmm. Absolutely. So yeah, well, the highlight of the year is fantastic praise. I think we've got competition for your highlight this year because you're just back from America, right?
Yes, I was lucky enough to attend the Mises University course, which I mean, I don't know if I can really then go and compare the two because I think honestly the work that you are doing as part of the Scyldings organization and as other people are doing in different side things that our end goal should really be building something like the Mises Institute because they have it like nowhere else, and the fact that all these people are in the one place throughout a good portion of the year sometimes, working together, studying, having a massive resource full of literature to go through. It's no wonder they can chuck out the amount of good work that they do and they get the amount of support from patrons that they do. It makes total sense to me. It becomes a no-brainer, especially once you go and visit. I mean, you go and look at Rothbard's library or the
Mm.
archives they have upstairs, or you just sit and engage with the lecturers casually over lunch. It's a bit like, I suppose maybe it's slightly different for me again because some of the characters that spoke last year I was familiar with, so I'd spoken to them on stream before. But even then, just to get that opportunity on, like, I think it was a Saturday night where me and John sat with AA and a few other folk and we just blethered all night about. Some of it was crap, but it's nice to get that sort of experience of properly intermingling in a setting where there's no live stream or cameras or microphones or anything like that. It's very sort of natural, and it was the same again at the Mises Institute, and I felt very privileged at times that I could engage with some of the lecturers there on their own level.
No, that's exactly right. And the Mises Institute was definitely part of our inspiration for what we're doing here. That bring with events, bringing people together in person. Because as you say, when you're having a chat with people in real life and you relaxed as you were with John, it's a completely different quality of conversation. Sometimes that quality means it's way more insightful when you can get into topics at a much faster rate and come up to interesting conclusions. But other times you say it's just it's you're just shooting the shit, and you can do that because there's no audience, right? And so it's a completely different vibe, and I think it's very valuable myself. But you're here now as a speaker, so
I am, yes.
that's,
I'm quite lucky. It's one of those ones where I was like, I sort of realized, oh wait, some of the people on the lineup you've got this year, it's like I better make sure to make a good showing of it.
And are you making a good show over then? I've seen. Well, obviously, we selected you from the pictures. We had many pictures this year, more than last year. So,
Mm.
I'm assuming that if it's anything to do with the pitch you gave us, it's going to be pretty damn good.
Well, I hope so. I think I'm at this point now. It's the 9th today when we're having this conversation anyway. I'm not entirely sure when it'll be up, but I've just about got my final sort of draft of my speech sorted. So it's just a case of spending the next kind of 2 weeks or so trying to memorizing it through as smoothly as possible. I don't think I'll ever be anyone that's good enough to present just off notes, not in any time soon. But as long as I can do a relatively smooth job with the full script in front of me, I think that should work well.
Great. And do you want to tell people what you're speaking on?
The subject, I suppose, the title is Propaganda: The Power of Logos in Mass Society. I mean, I don't want to do too many spoilers, but I will say that in part, it is largely an investigation of the, I would argue, fundamental link between power and public perception, and that arguably one and the same. They are arguably one and the same, and become very difficult to disaggregate. And using examples of stuff from things people will probably be familiar with me talking about, actually, that I've sort of all strung together in one sort of big sort of work that should hopefully be an interesting way for people maybe to become familiar with those ideas as if they haven't prior to. I mean, a bit like my speech last year that I'd written that was, I think, held as a backup, but still made it into the book, which I'm quite chuffed of. I drew on Lenin, who was a thinker that I think, at this time last year, people weren't drawing on as much as they are now. And that's maybe not entirely down to my effect, but I think me and other people pushing all these different sort of thinkers that we don't normally draw from in relation to a subject we are maybe more familiar with. And I think a lot of people would have a preconceived notion about what they think propaganda is or how it works. But through using the thinkers I've related to this year, hopefully I can shine a new sort of lens on it.
So what's the difference to you between propaganda and marketing? So I asked this because when you say power and public perception are in some way one and the same, now lots of the public perception is a quote unquote innocent marketing, right? So what's the difference between that and actual propaganda?
Well, I actually had this conversation with someone at the Mises U course at one point over the week. And it sort of suggested to them, well, propaganda has two main elements. There was a psychological component and there was an organizational component. And that both of these give you either commitments or ideas or actions maybe that are suggested towards you, and they can either be political or they can be commercial. And I think the way in which a political party advertises to you and then gets you to join its organization really isn't too different in a lot of ways from how an organization, maybe not even something that sells consumer products that are single use, but how you get integrated with a bank, who you choose for a mortgage, who you choose for an internet package, what social media you use. There is a psychological component that influences you towards using it, and then there's an organizational component that integrates you into it. So I would see no difference between marketing and propaganda. I would say it's all the same.
Okay, yes. When you mentioned the banks, it drew to mind a few banking adverts you see, like Lloyd's TSB and that sort of thing. And you noticed they're very similar now in their slogans to what's happening at the Tory leadership contest when they're talking about trust and integrity.
Well, that's why they use the color blue.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Nice neutral color, easy on the eye. Everyone likes blue. It's the color of the sky. Absolutely. So you would say then in mass society, is this drawing upon your favorite uncle?
I actually haven't referenced him in there. However, I've gone a further stage up the tree and I've focused mainly on Jacques Ellul, I suppose I should say. But I will try not to dabble in too many of the details, because he is frankly where Ted gets most of his best insights from, and the focus on the mass society element is one that is not just beholden to Ted either. I mean, I was recording something with Pete Q the other day and we were discussing this, that both James Burnham and Sam Francis heavily focus on what they refer to as the revolution of mass and scale, through which systems and techniques ultimately were developed that allowed for mass communication, that allowed for mass programming through radio, television, telegram, newspapers, all these different aspects that then became what we think of as culture now. We're not really there to, even though someone might argue that the absolute monarchies in France, had their propaganda, they had their press knocking out papers. It was never the same way as it is nowadays, where we are inundated with political messaging everywhere we go. It's actually very difficult to avoid it.
No, that's definitely the difference between now and the past. Just the ubiquity of marketing and messages is unparalleled.
Mm,
Um, you mentioned these technologies of mass communication allowing for what Francis calls the mass and scale, the revolution of that.
mm,
In I'm just trying to think of the author. There's a book called A Sovereign Individual by Lord Rees-Mogg, and in that they go through some of the history of communication as well. And
mm.
they report that radio and mass printing were at the time considered to be disruptive revolutionary activities. And it's only when the war, essentially World War I and World War II came about, that the state was able to control these mediums and use
Mm.
it to bind society together.
Well, I would say this is. I don't necessarily. I sort of relate to World War One in the speech, but the point of sort of deliberately turning and consciously realizing how these networks could be used, I think, is one of the most important parts to take out of it,
Mm.
because you're starting to understand that there are, there is the managerial revolution as we see it, and we look at the managerial class. But I think at times people don't go the stage further that they should, which is to understand that within the managerial class itself, there are elites. There are those who are at the top of that tree, and that their real proficiency that gets them up there is not that they are adherent to a certain ideology, but more that they are highly technically proficient, and they understand that technical necessity comes before even things like ideology or consistency or truth, or all these elements we would normally think is the components a statesman would draw on are almost irrelevant nowadays to just pure sort of technical proficiency.
When we say technical here, you're meaning technical in the way of people managing and organizational skills, or are you thinking
Anything,
technical?
anything that involves the exercise of specific techniques or specialized processes. It
Mm.
could be, as you say, the physical organizing of people into parties and making them involved in the process of democracy. It could be mass mobilizing them in terms of getting them in cars so they can drive to different factories. This proficiency could be as granular as you wish it to be, depending on how insularly you wish to focus on one specific task, or whether or not you want to take the grander vision of, the proficiency for someone at the top of the tree, like in a World Economic Forum position, might not be that, oh well, we need an extra 150,000 people this year to pay this tax bill, and we need an incentive to do it. Instead, they are more concerned about how are the different rungs of the ladder in the managerial class operating? How efficiently organized are the organizers?
Yes. I'm just thinking. So at the moment, I'm thinking of social media, right? So social media
Mhm.
is the current method which is dominating our communication platforms. The people who run the social media companies, or who at least were running them until relatively recently, were people who were technically proficient in computing, networking, that sort of activity. And
Mm.
these were all founders, CEOs, and that's increasingly not the case. If you look at Twitter and Google and a few others, none of the people who run these companies were the people who made the tech. They're often now people who are technically proficient in the more organizational skills you were talking about.
Mm.
So do you
Well,
think this change can signal these companies, this new method of communication, becoming part of the
well,
power apparatus you're talking about?
I would say the fact that there is maybe we would need to be more specific with certain examples, but there is, of course, on the face of it, the problem of they're no longer really being the owner entrepreneur anymore. There is more often than not a board of directors or a
Hmm.
board of CEOs or whatever title they wish to call them, who are in some way, shape, or form elected by the people that hold the share and the stock of the company and blah, 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 blah. And this is again a point that's brought up in the managerial revolution by Burnham and later on by Francis and Leviathan and its enemies, that once you have this board structure over a company, it becomes managerial from top to bottom.
Hmm.
And that, he always uses the example of Henry Ford. Henry Ford would have understood technically how to build his own cars, but I get what you mean in the sense that someone that runs Twitter now wouldn't know how to program every single element of it, but that in and of itself is part of the sort of gambit, because they don't need to be technically proficient at knowing how to build Twitter anymore. They just need to be technically proficient at organizing the people inside Twitter.
How is this different from, say, an absolute monarch who also is not going to understand how his society functions, but they're going to have to lean on for people with various technical specialties, and what they're meant to be good at is organizing people, selecting talent, that sort of thing? How is that different from the processes which select for this managerial class you're describing?
Well, the barriers to entry are a lot different. We no longer look at people in terms of character or a sort of more organic or holistic sort of way of measuring who they are as people. We don't think about, faith or what culture they are of, what skin type they may have. Instead, we focus on very sort of narrowly defined meritocratic measures that are normally some kind of degree or doctorate from X, Y, or Z specific elite university. I mean, there is always an element of elitism in society. There are always people who will be the organizers, and there are always people who be the organized.
Mm-hmm.
So, in some sense, there is always this relationship that is universal, but the strictures of how people circulate between the lower rungs and the higher rungs, or how the different people on different elite groups manifest in positions of power or can't is the thing that varies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think you're saying whilst today we select almost purely on these technical competencies, in the past they would have had a wider selection of metrics, if you like, to determine whether someone should be in position.
Well, there would also been an element more of more honest sort of predestination, instead of it just sort of being the case that you go to university now, and if you're an average person, you just end up with some sort of semi-crap job that you don't really want.
Mm-hmm.
The only people who can really get the most out of a university degree are people whose mum or dad already works in a bank or some think tank or has some other business that they can pass down to them. And now that's, in your terms of talking about kings or aristocrats in the past, obviously titles were passed down through bloodline, but there was a much more sort of honest and open component of that. Whereas nowadays we have these sort of false notions of democracy and social mobility that means that, oh, well, actually we've created a measure so that people passing privileges on to their children no longer works anymore, and those privileges are voting that doesn't matter and business and entrepreneurship that doesn't work anymore.
Yes, well, business and entrepreneurship certainly doesn't work anymore, especially with all the economic mayhem which is going on at the moment. You came actually from the more economic side of things, and you drifted into the more political analysis over time. What was the reason for that? Why did you lose interest in pure economics?
I mean, I still have a great interest in it, as probably evident by the fact that I was willing to go away and travel for, across the globe just to have some lectures for 5-6 days. But
yeah,
at some point, once you begin to understand and become confident in the fact that specifically the School of Austrian Economics is the way that the economy works, it is the way that human decision making works. And you think about that for long enough, and then you realize, well, if this isn't what's being implemented, then there must be a reason for why that's the case. Mm-hmm. And the answer to that question doesn't lie in reading more economic theory. It lies in reading political theory and reading history and philosophy and a wide variety of subjects, which outside of the normally more dry economic stuff that I'm more than happy to read, it can be a bit more interesting, especially when it's something really punchy. Like the first time I sat and really read through some big sections of Carlyle, I thought, this is great. This is better than any bloody storybook I read as a kid.
No, that's fair enough. Okay, you're quite keen to leave contents of your talk for the event. It seems. I think the other people in the interviews have been a bit more loose-lipped. But no, I like this. Just saying a few things and leaving it to the audience to actually come and buy a ticket.
Well, of course, you've got to sell it to them. I'm presenting the physical, or sorry, the psychological teasing of the mainline sort of subjects, and then I'm relating them to the organizational structure they can integrate themselves into, that being Scyldings.
Absolutely. Integrate yourself into the organizational structure, buy a ticket for the Witan. Do you have anything else you want to mention before we draw this up?
I suppose I can just say to people, if they want to go and find me, they can do so on Telegram and the YouTube videos I do with Scrump and the streams, which I'm sure most people will probably know anyway. And we will hopefully have some news about our own next event coming up before the end of this year. Yes,
I've been to both of your events previously, and I enjoyed them both. So I'm looking forward to that as well. And absolutely, you were banned off Twitter, I believe, and that's why you're on Telegram permanently. Is that right?
Yeah, it's also the fact that it's easy enough to make a new Twitter and use it, but I just find myself greatly, I don't know, kind of disappointed, really, in that I should have found out sooner myself how much time I was wasting on there, and I worry that there are lots of people around us who could be doing great stuff with their time, then spend hours of it on Twitter. And I don't think, as we've discussed, both at Scyldings and Nomos events previous, that spending all day online is not how you win.
No.
To put simply.
No, and Telegram's a bit easier to manage your time on, I assume.
Yes.
Okay, well, on that, you should manage your time. Come see Evelyn at the Witan and hear her talk on.
Please do. But also, don't just come for me, because it's a great evening, or not evening, sorry, it's a great weekend anyway.
No, absolutely. And
icing on the cake.
Bring a suit if you can. We all look good.
And a cigar.
And the cigar or two, or if you're some of the people who attended last year, more than two. Yeah. All right, great. And we'll see you at the end of the month, Evelyn. Enjoy, everyone.
I'll see you at the end of the month. Best of luck.